Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hi everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett, and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. Harvest is in full swing. We're coming to you today from a cornfield located in southeast Nebraska. As we begin today's show, we wanted to share these harvest scenes from across the state. First, on what he calls the east coast of Nebraska, Quentin in Tacoma shared this shot of his corn harvest. We head to more central Nebraska now for this photo from Joe Ganguish near St. Paul. Just to the south in Clay County, Aaron snapped this bird's eye view with his drone. Dropping down a little bit now to Carlton, Mike is testing the capacity there on his grain cart. Looks like it's about full, Mike. Finally, we travel out to southwest Nebraska, where Jan shared this after sunset photo. We appreciate those photos this week and wish all those out in the fields a safe harvest. Coming up on this week's show, Al Dutcher will give us an extended harvest forecast. We'll also get the latest on the grain markets, but first. Tar spot has been an increasing concern among corn producers around the cornhusker state. While signs of tar spot at this point in the season aren't necessarily bad news when it comes to this year's yield totals, this is a disease that will overwinter in fields, and it's always a good idea to get tabs on where it might creep up. Tar spot was first detected in the U.S. back in 2015 and has since made its way through the Midwest and into Nebraska. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamara Jackson-Zims tells us that Extension educators are requesting that producers help researchers to keep tabs on this potentially threatening disease in order to be as vigilant as possible as we head into 2023.
It's spread all the way across Iowa now, and it has made its way into Nebraska. And so if you look at our monitoring website on the corn IPM pipe tar spot website, you'll see that we've got more than a dozen counties lit up in gray and yellow, showing where the pathogen has been confirmed, and we've got tar spot development. I can tell you that it is likely more widespread than that, and our goal is to make sure that we document where this disease is, even in the remaining weeks that we've got left in the season. Not because we're worried about the impact on yield this year or in Nebraska, but this fungus will overwinter in Nebraska, and it'll continue to develop into tar spot in subsequent years, continue to worsen and spread to new areas. And so it's important that we know where this is and that we can advise people to monitor those fields.
Tar spot will thrive in environments that are cold and wet. This means there's high likelihood of seeing tar spot develop in this stage of the season, even if you haven't seen any indications of it out in your fields this year. It might especially be important to scout around your irrigation pivots.
Look on the leaves for the black dots. These are fungal structures, stromata, but this is where the spores are being produced. They are splashed and blown around, and that's how it's moved from other locations. And so if you think you see some black spots on leaves, try to wipe those off. If they wipe off, usually it's insect frass. You might need to wet it first and rub a little vigorously, but if you can't rub that off, or if it goes all the way through to the bottom side and it looks like black paint or tar has been splattered on the leaf, there's a good chance you found tar spot. So please share that with us at the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic or your local county extension educator.
When scouting this particular pathogen, there are some telltale signs to be a dead giveaway for the presence of the disease in your fields. However, there are a few things to pay attention to in order to ensure you're not making any false diagnosis.
I talked about what tar spot looks like on corn leaves, but there are a few things that might be easily confused with it. And so at the end of the season, like we are now, you will commonly see black spots on corn leaves. These aren't raised, and these are actually on dead tissue and caused by beneficial fungi that we call saprophytes. They're very common this time of year. And if you look closely, you'll see they're not as clearly defined around the margins as what you see with a tar spot, stromata or ascomata, what we're looking for. So they won't rub off either, but if you look on the side of a leaf and you look at a tar spot stromata, you're going to notice that it looks a bit raised above the surface as that fungus sticks up above there, but you may not necessarily be able to feel that.
Now, if you have any questions or concerns about tar spot in your fields, you can contact the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic. You can also find the latest updates on this disease and all of the issues facing crop producers online at the website cropwatch.unl.edu. Moving on now, weedy plant encroachment is a process that causes a state transition from one type of ecosystem to another. The Great Plains climate supports both grassland and woodland ecosystems. Which of these ecosystems dominates and thrives has historically been dependent on fire vegetation feedbacks. At this year's Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory Open House, we got an up-close look at some methods for eastern red cedar mitigation that could be helpful for producers across the state. Market Journal's Mike Straub has this story.
More and more grasslands in Nebraska are disappearing due to woody encroachment. Reducing exposure to seed sources is a big step in decreasing the vulnerability of our grasslands.
Our grassland exposure to seed source and seed dispersal has changed so dramatically over the last century, and what impact that's had on grassland risk to encroachment. And so what we're actually starting to encourage as new best management practices is using management to reduce exposure to the problem. So if we can reduce exposure to seed sources and manage grassland sensitivity so that our grasslands aren't as vulnerable to encroachment.
Annual rangeland production losses due to woody encroachment can be hard to fathom.
We now have the data to track rangeland production losses annually. And what we see in Nebraska in 2019 is 419,000 tons of rangeland production were lost to woody plant encroachment.
If you break down the numbers, over 70,000 cows could be fed from the amount of rangeland being lost on an annual basis.
Yeah, it's difficult to understand how much 419,000 tons of production is. And so we've actually broken it down into round bales. And it's just about 700,000 1,200-pound round bales is how much production we've lost due to woody encroachment in 2019. And so if we took those round bales and we laid them out side by side, that would cover more than the distance from Kansas City to Denver. As another comparison, that's enough forage to support just under 70,000 cows for a year.
Increase in tree cover is becoming unmanageable in our grassland prairies. To reach the scale of the problem, upping the scale of management is necessary.
So we've looked at trends, and what we see at large scales like the state or even more ecoregion specific is we're seeing increases in tree cover. Some areas in the western part of the state are experiencing more early trends. Cover is still low, increasing slowly. While in areas in the east or tallgrass prairie, we're seeing much more steady and consistent losses in our grasslands. Unfortunately, at large scales, we have almost no evidence of being able to halt and reverse those trends. So I'll point to the Les Canyons. Once we've seen trends of encroachment, they're the only region that's been able to stabilize that trend, and they've been able to do it using prescribed fire throughout the community, where they've actually been able to scale up management to account for the scale of the problem.
Two main factors are causing vulnerabilities to our grasslands. Increasing one and decreasing the other might lead to a solution.
Fire has historically limited trees in the Great Plains. Eastern red cedar is an extremely fire-sensitive species. We've largely removed fire from our grasslands. That's made them more vulnerable to red cedar. In addition, we've introduced seed sources through tree planting programs throughout the Great Plains, including in Nebraska. And so those two factors have really contributed to trends of encroachment. The earlier you can act, the better. There's things you can do before you have a problem. Once you have a problem, the earlier you act, the more economically effective or efficient control is going to be. So I guess that would be my message is don't wait to act, and act early.
To save grassland prairies from being overcome by trees, acting early and acting fast is the best method. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Mike Straub.
Thank you for that story, Mike. Now, if you have any questions or concerns when it comes to eastern red cedar and ways you can cut down on these trees in your grasslands, you can learn more at the website. You've heard us share it before. It's cropwatch.unl.edu. Shifting our focus over to the grain markets now. This week, we were joined by Doug Simon from Tredas here in the final trading week of September. The month is living up to its reputation as being one of the toughest months for bullish sentiment. We began the discussion with Doug on Wednesday afternoon by getting his general take on the grain complex.
There's big basis opportunities on corn right now. We've been trading anywhere from 40 over to 70 over, and so we've been recommending, asking, farmers, hey, let's move some of that corn right now, get it in there. It's a really good basis. We may get back to those levels later on in December, January, February, March, but that's a tremendous basis to be selling right off the combine today. With 670 futures and 40 over basis, that's a good cash price.
What are you hearing in terms of yields out there with the customers you serve?
Well, I grew up in east of Lincoln here, south of Omaha and Cass County, and our yields out there are running 120 bushels to 150, maybe a little better in some spots, depending on where they had better rains and better soils, but about 100 bushels less than probably what we had last year. Soybeans are running in the 30s, 35, 40. Even irrigated yields kind of up, Highway 81 on the soybean side of it, down from what they were last year. So, but the amount of rain that we've had, we expected them to be lower. Probably the one thing is like the irrigated corn, irrigated beans is going to be interesting as we get into deeper into harvest to see how those yields hold up. Some disappointment right now from what I'm seeing so far.
Let's talk about some of the factors influencing the commodity trade. Look at our corn soybean charts here. We haven't seen a lot of strength in terms of rallies in the month of September. What are some of the factors influencing that?
Well, we had the high this summer on Dees corn was at 760 and we fell to 560 and now we're back to 670. So we had the $2 range there and now we've rebounded. Actually, we were back 50% of that range. We did go up close to $7 after the last USDA report when they dropped the yield 6.5 bushels. And the beans, we were $13 low kind of recently. We were 16 this summer in June, then went to 13, and now we almost went back to 15 after the report as well. So now today we're just 14.10 or so on no soybeans. So we're still $1 off the low, $2 off the high. So we've had quite a bit of a rebound actually. So the question is, are we going to continue on that trend? I think it comes down to what we're going to see at September, end of the month. We have the stocks report, which will be real interesting to see how much corn and beans are out there and how much we drew down those stocks, which seem to be pretty tight based on the basis levels that we saw out there. So, but then our next report in October, USDA is going to weigh pods and weigh ears, and we'll see, that'll be the biggest survey. We talk about yields from what we see with farmers we're dealing with, but it'll be interesting to see what USDA sees in those weights out there and how it's all going to add up.
Well, Doug, I know you've been keeping an eye on a lot of things lately. One of the things is the dollar, because we've seen 20-year highs, if I believe I saw that right. Also, the interest rates out there. We saw the Fed increase that. What do you want to share about those two things?
Well, we've been in a 30-year rally in the bond market, the 30-year bonds. They've gone from 92 or 95 level in 1992, and they've had a peak in the middle of COVID in March of 2020, around 200, and now they've fallen back to 125. So as the government's tried to kind of squelch inflation, they've been increasing interest rates, so the bond market's been dropping, and so that's had a pretty significant impact. As those interest rates increase, it basically attracts investment in the U.S. And so people have to buy U.S. dollars to invest that money in the U.S. So, people are surprised, like all the strength in the U.S. dollar, like all the things that are going on in the world that are crazy and volatile. But the U.S. is still probably the strongest economy out there in the world. That has something to do with it. But also those interest rates are attracting more money into the U.S. So it's kind of it's not all that, surprising. But it also has an impact on our trading partners. So the pound, for example, hit a low this week. So everybody's worried about that. But really, who imports our corn? Mexico, China to a limited degree, Japan, South Korea. Those should be the ones that we're concerned about in terms of those exchange rate values. So back in the 80s when we had really strong dollar, we were worried about that impacting corn exports. Corn exports are lagging about 10 points where they typically are this time of the year. The beans are a little bit ahead of pace, which is good. But the big picture is that, how much income do people have to buy our commodities eventually?
As we round out this conversation, Doug, I want to see if I understand your perspective right when it comes to this harvest time. You're saying haul as much maybe as you can to town when it comes to corn, soybeans, and play maybe on the, whether it's the safer side or not, on the futures market. Do I understand that right?
Well, I think with the basis levels being as firm as they are, that you want to move, that's the signal to sell your cash grain. So where the futures are going to go from there, you don't necessarily know. But if you look at commodities seasonally, December corn tends to put in a bottom here later in October, tends to have a rally post-harvest. If you look at soybeans, it tends to happen about this time of the year and rallies in through May. So if you look at years where like our fall prices are higher than our springtime price, we tend to have more rallies. So, I mean, which is because of the lower crops, I mean, we probably should see some strength longer term. So if you want to keep ownership of beans, it's easier to buy some, instead of paying storage at the elevator of 6 to 8 cents a month, use calls, or you can buy the board, you can do some things, but that's going to be cheaper than just paying storage at the elevator. There's cheaper ways to do it, maybe less, you know, in terms of you don't know where the direction of the board is going to go, but it's definitely less expensive than stored in an elevator.
Our thanks, as always, to Doug for his time. Now, coming up next week, we'll be joined by Darren Newsome. If you have any questions you'd like for me to ask Darren, be sure you email us and I'll pass your questions along. Well, Nebraska Extension acts as a trusted educational line for every Nebraskan, connecting people wherever they are in the state. Each of Nebraska's 93 counties has an advisory extension board that oversees the local extension program development and delivery. Each of these board members are asked to be a connection between their community and the university. You can learn more about the duties of those local extension boards in the September issue of the Nebraska Farmer. Well, it is now time for weather with Nebraska Extension AG Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. As harvest rolls on, Al has this extended look at what we can expect for weather this fall.
Well, folks, I'm away from the office this week as I'm up in northern Michigan taking care of the orchard. So I thought this was a perfect time to give you an update of what I think will be some of the things to watch out for as we go through this fall period, particularly since we've been coming off of such a significant drought across a good portion of the state. First and foremost, let's look at the official fall forecasts that were issued here about 2 weeks ago. First and foremost is the monthly temperature, a preliminary forecast that shows above normal temperatures centered across the Central Plains. Nebraska sitting in the southern half, sitting right in the core of this area in terms of precipitation. Most of the southern plains all the way to the western United States coast, below normal, slightly lower risk as you get up into extreme northeast and northern Nebraska. Now as we look at the forecast for the fall period, CPC is indicating equal chances to our north, just a slight chance for above normal temperatures for most of Nebraska. And in regards to precipitation, again, a slight chance in the southwestern 2/3 of the state for below normal moisture, with the core of it down to our south. Now that being said, this is a preliminary, these are based off the preliminary forecast, and there will be an official update at the end of the month for the monthly forecast, and usually that's tied directly to whatever the jet stream pattern is showing for the first half of October. So more importantly, the things that I'm kind of looking at first and foremost is once again looking for a third year of La Nina conditions, and I didn't even expect this, but one of the things we're noticing is this core area just above the equator, and this would be on the northern side of the Pacific, has been warmer than normal, and we have been seeing upwelling cold water on occasion, but it has not had the ability to break this warm pocket down. So this cold or the colder than normal sea surface temperatures you see here is basically this endless string of hurricanes that have been going off of the coast of Mexico. And we are well above what the forecasts were from the National Hurricane Center. In fact, we are now at the 12th named storm, and probably we'll see the 13th named storm here within this next week. More importantly, looking underneath of the depth, we see the return current, and we see this cold pocket coming up. And every time one of these cold pockets come to the surface, we call these Kelvin waves, we see that this warm pocket disappears, but it reemerges. So this tells me that there's not enough oomph, so to speak, for this to overwhelm and completely engulf all of the equatorial Pacific. Therefore, one of the things we will be watching for is whether or not we start to see the development of low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska, eastern Gulf of Alaska, that will renew the cold currents coming in and feeding into the Central Pacific. Currently, the statistical models say that this La Nina event will go all the way into the late winter, early spring period. The dynamical models ended as we get toward the end of the year, into the early part of the year. And more importantly, some of the dynamical models, and more and more of them, are coming to the conclusion that we may actually see this develop into a weak El Nino event as we go into late next year. So one of the other items to be watching for is hurricane formation. That's the big wild card. We haven't seen the activity in the Atlantic as projected, but we're starting to see an uptick the last couple weeks. We're basically sitting at the point of time where most of the hurricane activity will start during the month of October, will start to develop in this region as there's too much cold air aloft and too much shearing coming from troughs coming over the Atlantic to get activity going, and that makes it very uncertain in the Gulf of Mexico whether or not we will see some of these storms make landfall along the Gulf Coast. So from a standpoint of the upper air pattern, kind of giving an example, we're starting to see troughing actually coming into the western part of the United States, a little earlier than normal, but we're seeing that break off. So the big key issue is whether we get in through the month of October and November, whether these troughs start to come forward or whether they split that energy off to our north. If they continue this type of a pattern, then we are going to see dry conditions across the southern plains. And if they don't, then we will see a much cooler pattern and stormier pattern as we go through the month of October and November.
Thank you very much, Al. Finally today, wildfires, as we know, have certainly been a thorn in the side of some producers this year. Wildfires can cause immediate loss of available forage and soil protection residue cover. The longer-term effects, though, of wildfire on range and pastures can be variable. However, most rangeland plants are quite resilient, and proper management after a fire can speed up that recovery process. We recently caught up with Oklahoma State University Extension Specialist for Rangeland Ecology, that is Dr. Laura Gudmundsen. We saw her at this year's Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory Open House, and we got her advice on post-fire grazing. Market Journal's Bill Dodd shares this story.
With an abundance of drought conditions and limited precipitation events, wildfires have been fairly prevalent around Nebraska this summer, and that's meant a lot of lost forage for cattle producers. With that in mind, post-fire grazing was a hot topic at this year's Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory Open House event. OSU Extension Specialist for Rangeland Ecology, Dr. Laura Gudmundsen, had one take-home message from her presentation that should give some hope to those who have been impacted by these fire events.
My big take-home message I would say that is these grasses are very well adapted to grazing in fire. And so although we have wildfires that happen here, they can recover fairly quickly. It really depends on a couple of things. First of all, the management before and after that wildfire, and then also the weather conditions. Do we get rain after that fire for those plants to go ahead and regrow? The longer that you don't get rain and those soils stay exposed, the more likely that you'll have some kind of erosion that's happening, either wind or water erosion. But if it's during a normal year, those grasses can recover really quickly, even within a growing season.
Looking at the immediate aftermath of a wildfire may seem highly discouraging. However, Dr. Gudmundsen tells us following a rangeland fire, odds of recovery are good, and there might even be a slight chance of grazing that land the same year. However, you'll want to cut back on those stocking rates.
With as little rain as has fallen in some places, I'd be reluctant to say go ahead and graze it full blown. So, if you had a lot of people with drought are really trying to hang on to as many cattle as possible, if you really had to graze those pastures, make sure that you're not stocking them normally. You'd want to cut back. But I feel pretty positive, especially after the report on what's going to happen next summer, that if we have normal rain conditions in the next year, everything's going to be back to normal. And if you have good rain after a fire in general, you could probably graze it even within the same year. We do that a lot in our pastures, and it works really, really well in Oklahoma during normal years. So having the right stocking rate that fits your land is really important, and the productivity of your grasses. So figuring out what that stocking rate is and refiguring it every now and then, because sometimes those things can change. I think having an idea of what your productivity is, Extension and NRCS can typically help you with figuring out what your production is. There's also a tool that you could try called the Rangeland Analysis Platform to actually figure out what your stocking rate might be, and it's using satellite imagery to estimate productivity. It's a really excellent tool. It's just a website you can find online, and it's free.
Another thing to keep in mind would be the best way to rotate those animals without the need or cost of utilizing additional fence. One possible alternative would be to use a method called patch burn grazing.
And we know it has many, many benefits for lots of different wildlife species. And so I would recommend looking into that if you're somebody that's interested in using prescribed fire. It also has lots of benefits for your cattle as far as reducing supplementation, higher weight gains for yearlings if you're grazing yearlings. And so just grazing, burning a portion of your pasture, stocking it normally, and allowing those animals to graze immediately following that fire. That also can help with stockpiling. And so, you know, planning for drought is a really important part of managing our land, and that provides you to stockpile in those areas that haven't had a burn recently. So those are things that I would think about. You know, there's a lot of things to manage for in these lands. Woody plant encroachment is something that's happening, and we need to get a handle on it for sure, because it decreases productivity far more than drought or anything else. And so where it's happening, and so we need to come up with management strategies where we really protect the areas that are not converting over to you know, woody encroached areas, and keep those as grasslands. So fire is just a really useful tool, so patch burn grazing kind of fits within that.
If grazing is planned on burned areas, grazing management practices like sustainable stocking rates and periodic rest need to be applied to promote strong growth of desired plant communities. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thank you for that information, Bill. If you'd like to learn more from Dr. Gudmundsen about post-fire land management, we've included a helpful link along with this story. You can find that on the Market Journal website. Well, that is all the time we have for this week's show. You can follow along with the team during the week by liking Market Journal on Facebook or by following us on Twitter or Instagram. We hope to see you back here next time. Until then, I'm Bryce Duskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.